You have just unlocked something most people will never consciously recognize about themselves. You are reading these words right now, and something deeper is happening beneath the surface of your awareness, something that places you in a cognitive territory that Jean Piaget spent decades mapping. But here is what troubles me about this moment. You probably dismiss the extraordinary mental processes occurring inside your mind as ordinary, as baseline, as nothing special. You tell yourself that everyone thinks this way. You convince yourself that the abstract reasoning, the metacognitive awareness, the hypothetical deductions you perform dozens of times each day are somehow common abilities shared universally. And in that dismissal, in that underestimation of your own cognitive architecture, you rob yourself of understanding just how far your mind has traveled from its origins. Let me be specific about what I mean. Right now, as you process these sentences, you are not simply decoding symbols on a screen. You are holding multiple abstract concepts simultaneously in your working memory. You are anticipating where this argument will lead before I arrive there. You are critically evaluating my claims against your own experience. You are imagining scenarios that have never happened to test whether my statements hold validity. You are aware that you are thinking, and you are capable of thinking about that awareness itself. These are not universal human abilities. They are hard-won cognitive achievements that represent the final stage of a developmental journey that Jean Piaget discovered most people do not complete until adolescence, and that many individuals, for various reasons related to education and environment, never fully consolidate. Here is the problem that gnaws at your daily experience. You feel stuck. You feel as though you should be achieving more, understanding more, contributing more. You compare yourself to others who seem to navigate complexity with ease, who seem to grasp abstract principles instantly, who seem to operate on a different frequency. You wonder what they possess that you lack. You question your intelligence. You doubt your capabilities. You feel perpetually one step behind, always catching up, never quite arriving at the level where things click into place effortlessly. And this feeling creates a persistent background noise of inadequacy that colors your work, your relationships, your sense of self-worth. It whispers that you are not quite enough, not quite ready, not quite capable of the challenges you face. But what if I told you that this feeling is not evidence of deficiency, but rather the opposite? What if the very fact that you can experience this metacognitive doubt, this abstract self-evaluation, this hypothetical comparison between your current self and an imagined ideal self, is itself proof that you are operating at the highest level of cognitive development that Piaget identified? What if your mind has already crossed thresholds that billions of humans throughout history never approached? Today, I am going to show you 9 specific proofs, 9 concrete indicators that your thinking has already reached what Piaget called formal operational thought, the final and most sophisticated stage of cognitive development. Not everyone reaches this stage. Not everyone thinks this way. And by the end of this exploration, you will understand not only that you have arrived at this level, but also how to leverage this understanding to stop doubting yourself and start recognizing the extraordinary instrument you carry between your ears. Jean Piaget began his career not as a psychologist, but as a biologist studying mollusks. This detail matters more than it might initially appear. Piaget approached human cognition with a biological lens, viewing intelligence not as a fixed trait, but as an adaptive process, a constant interaction between organism and environment. In the early 1920s, while working in Alfred Binet's laboratory in Paris, Piaget was assigned the tedious task of standardizing intelligence tests for children. He was supposed to simply administer the tests and record which children answered correctly and which did not. But Piaget found himself captivated not by the correct answers, but by the errors, the systematic patterns of wrong answers that children of similar ages produced. A 5-year-old child would fail a particular logical problem not randomly, but in a predictable way. And most importantly, the nature of the error revealed something profound about how that child's mind was structured. One afternoon, Piaget sat across from a 7-year-old girl named Lucienne. He presented her with 2 identical glasses filled with equal amounts of water. Lucienne confirmed that both glasses contained the same amount. Then, as Lucienne watched, Piaget poured the water from one glass into a tall, thin cylinder. The water level rose higher in the narrow container. Piaget asked the simple question, which container now holds more water? Lucienne, without hesitation, pointed to the tall cylinder. When Piaget asked why, she explained that it was taller, so it must contain more. Piaget then poured the water back into the original glass, and Lucienne agreed they were equal again. He repeated the process, same result. The child could not hold in her mind the logical principle that quantity remains constant, despite changes in appearance. This principle, which Piaget called conservation, was not something Lucienne had forgotten or failed to learn. Her mind, at that stage of development, was literally incapable of grasping it. The cognitive structures necessary to understand conservation had not yet formed. This discovery revolutionized Piaget's understanding. Children were not simply small adults with less knowledge. They possessed fundamentally different cognitive architectures, different ways of constructing reality, and these architectures developed in predictable stages, each stage building upon the previous, each stage characterized by qualitatively different forms of reasoning. Piaget spent the next 5 decades mapping these stages with meticulous precision, studying his own 3 children from infancy and observing thousands of other children across different cultures and contexts. What emerged was a developmental sequence that remains one of the most robust findings in all of psychology. Sensory-motor stage from birth to age 2, pre-operational stage from 2 to 7, concrete operational stage from 7 to 11, and formal operational stage from 11 onward. But here is what most summaries of Piaget miss, what most people who encounter his theory in an introductory psychology course fail to grasp. The final stage, formal operational thought, is not simply an extension of what came before. It represents a cognitive revolution as dramatic as the difference between Lucienne's thinking and yours when you solve problems of conservation, effortlessly and automatically. Let me walk you through what happened in Piaget's laboratory when he studied adolescents who had reached this final stage. He presented a 15-year-old named Antoine with a problem involving a pendulum. Piaget showed Antoine a string with a weight attached, hanging from a support. He demonstrated that the pendulum could swing at different speeds. Then he explained that the pendulum's period, the time it takes to complete one swing, might be affected by several variables: the length of the string, the weight of the object, the height from which it is released, or the force of the initial push. Piaget provided Antoine with strings of different lengths, weights of different masses, and invited him to discover which variable determined the pendulum's period. Antoine did not approach this problem through random trial and error. Instead, he sat quietly for several minutes thinking. Then he announced his strategy. He would systematically vary one factor while holding all others constant. He began by testing different weights while keeping string length, release height, and push force identical. He carefully observed and recorded results. Then he moved to the next variable, systematically isolating each factor. After methodical testing, Antoine concluded correctly that only string length affected the period. What Antoine demonstrated was not simply problem-solving ability. Lucienne could solve problems too, within her developmental constraints. What Antoine displayed was something qualitatively different: hypothetical deductive reasoning. Before conducting any physical test, Antoine generated hypotheses about possible relationships between variables. He reasoned about possibilities, not just actualities. He designed a systematic experiment in his mind before executing it physically. He understood the logic of controlled experimentation, the principle that to determine causation, you must vary one factor while holding others constant. He could think about his own thinking, monitoring his problem-solving strategy and adjusting it based on results. He operated not in the concrete world of observable objects, but in the abstract world of logical relationships, possibilities, and systematic combinations. This is formal operational thought. This is the cognitive level that allows science, philosophy, complex mathematics, legal reasoning, ethical analysis, strategic planning, and every other domain of abstract, systematic thinking that characterizes advanced human cognition. Now here is where this becomes personal to you. Here is where Piaget's decades of research translate into your daily experience. Most discussions of formal operational thought treat it as an academic classification, a box to check on a developmental timeline. But Piaget understood something more profound. He recognized that reaching this stage meant acquiring cognitive tools that fundamentally alter how you experience reality itself, and he identified specific markers, specific capabilities that emerge only when formal operational structures have consolidated in your mind. I am about to walk you through 9 of these markers, 9 proofs that your thinking has already crossed into this territory, and I want you to notice something as we proceed. I want you to notice how many of these capacities you take for granted, how many you assume everyone possesses, how many you have never consciously recognized as achievements. Because that is precisely the problem. You carry extraordinary cognitive instruments and fail to recognize their power because they have become so integrated into your daily functioning that they feel invisible. The first proof appears in your relationship with time itself. You possess the ability to engage in systematic future planning based on hypothetical scenarios. Notice the layers in that statement. Not just planning, which even animals do in limited ways. Not just thinking about the future, which appears in concrete operational children who can anticipate Christmas morning. But systematic planning based on hypotheticals, on scenarios that do not yet exist and may never exist. You can sit down and think, if I pursue career path A, then X, Y, and Z consequences will likely follow. But if I pursue career path B, then different consequences emerge, and I can compare these two purely hypothetical futures against each other, and against a third option I just invented. You can hold multiple possible timelines simultaneously in your mind, evaluate them according to abstract criteria that you yourself have generated based on your values and goals, and make decisions in the present based on these comparisons of unrealized possibilities. Concrete operational children cannot do this. They can think about what is, what they have directly experienced. They can think about what will be if current trends continue, but they cannot systematically generate and compare multiple hypothetical futures. That capacity requires formal operational structures. You do this so regularly, so automatically, that you probably fail to recognize it as a cognitive achievement. Every time you make a decision matrix, every time you list pros and cons of options that have not happened, every time you strategize about possible outcomes, you are deploying formal operational thought. The second proof lives in your ability to think about systems rather than just elements. You can hold in your mind the concept of a system as an abstract entity, with properties that emerge from the relationships between components, rather than from the components themselves. Let me make this concrete. A child in the concrete operational stage can understand that a bicycle has wheels, pedals, a chain, handlebars. They can understand that each part has a function, but they struggle to think about the bicycle as a system, to understand that the bicycle's functionality emerges from the relationships and interactions between these parts, and that changing one relationship cascades through the entire system. You, however, think systemically all the time. When you consider how a change in one area of your life will affect other areas, you are thinking systemically. When you recognize that a problem at work is not really about the surface issue, but about underlying communication patterns or incentive structures, you are thinking systemically. When you understand that addressing a symptom without addressing root causes will fail, you are thinking systemically. This systems thinking, this ability to reason about abstract relationships and emergent properties, is a hallmark of formal operational thought. Piaget demonstrated this by presenting children and adolescents with problems involving gears, pulleys, and mechanical systems. Younger children described the parts. Adolescents described the relationships and understood that the system's behavior could not be predicted by examining parts in isolation. The third proof appears in your metacognitive awareness. You think about your thinking. You monitor your own cognitive processes. You can pause in the middle of solving a problem and evaluate whether your approach is working. You can recognize your own biases and attempt to correct for them. You can distinguish between what you know, what you think you know, and what you do not know. This metacognition, this cognition about cognition, requires a level of abstraction that formal operational structures make possible. You must be able to take your own mental processes as objects of thought, to step outside your immediate cognitive experience and reflect on it. Piaget studied this by asking adolescents, not just to solve problems, but to explain their reasoning, to describe why they chose particular strategies, to evaluate the effectiveness of different approaches. Concrete operational children can solve problems within their capabilities, but they struggle to articulate their reasoning or to think about thinking itself. You have conversations with yourself about whether you are thinking clearly, whether you are being rational, whether your emotions are clouding your judgment. These internal dialogues are evidence of formal operational thought. Okay, I need to pause here and check in with you directly, because I know what might be happening right now. You are reading about these cognitive capacities, and part of you is resonating, recognizing these patterns in your own thinking. But another part of you might be dismissing this, telling yourself that everyone does these things, that there is nothing special here, that I am overstating the case. And I want to acknowledge that reaction because it is actually evidence of the very cognitive level we are discussing. Your ability to hold skepticism, to critically evaluate my claims, to resist persuasion until you see sufficient evidence, these are themselves formal operational capacities. But here is what I want you to reflect on. Think about a specific moment in your life when you felt cognitively overwhelmed, when you faced a problem that seemed beyond your ability to solve, when you doubted whether your mind was adequate to the challenges before you. Can you picture that moment? Can you feel the frustration, the inadequacy, the sense of being lost in complexity? I know that feeling intimately because every human who thinks abstractly has experienced it. Now I want you to write in the comments this simple phrase: I thought I was behind, but I was already there. Copy that exact phrase and share it below. Your experience of cognitive overwhelm, that moment you are remembering, might be exactly what someone else reading this needs to hear about to realize they are not alone in feeling inadequate, despite actually being cognitively sophisticated. You have more power to help others recognize their own capabilities than you realize. That phrase, that simple acknowledgement, could be the permission someone needs today to stop doubting themselves. The fourth proof emerges in your capacity for abstract idealism. You can think about ideal states that have never existed and use them as standards for evaluating reality. You possess concepts like justice, equality, authenticity, integrity, not as descriptions of what is, but as abstract standards of what should be. And you can use these abstract ideals to critique existing systems, institutions, and practices. Piaget observed that adolescents suddenly become capable of idealistic thinking and social criticism in ways that younger children do not. A concrete, operational child understands fairness in immediate, concrete terms. You got 2 cookies and I got 1. That is not fair. But formal, operational adolescents develop abstract theories of justice that they apply universally. They become passionate about social issues, outraged by hypocrisy, committed to causes. This capacity to think about ideals and to use them as leverage points for critiquing reality requires formal operational structures. You engage in this constantly. Every time you evaluate whether something is right or wrong based on principles rather than consequences, every time you imagine how things could be better, every time you feel moral outrage at injustice, you are deploying formal operational thought. The younger mind cannot separate is from ought. Your mind makes this distinction automatically. The fifth proof lives in your ability to engage in propositional logic. You can reason about propositions themselves, independent of their content or truth value. You understand that if P implies Q and Q implies R, then P implies R, and you can apply this logical structure regardless of what P, Q, and R represent. Piaget tested this by presenting problems like, all bloops are razzles, all razzles are lazzles. If I have a bloop, what else do I have? Concrete operational children struggle with this because bloops, razzles, and lazzles are not real things they have experienced. They cannot reason about pure logical relationships divorced from concrete content. You, however, do this constantly. Every time you follow a legal argument, every time you understand a mathematical proof, every time you recognize that someone's reasoning is valid even though you disagree with their premises, you are engaging propositional logic. This capacity to think about the form of an argument separate from its content is uniquely formal operational. The sixth proof appears in your ability to think probabilistically, and to reason about proportions. You understand that outcomes can be more or less likely rather than simply certain or impossible. You grasp that increasing one variable might increase another proportionally, and you can reason about these relationships abstractly. Piaget demonstrated this with probability problems involving colored balls drawn from bags and with proportion problems involving chemical mixtures. Concrete operational children struggle with these because they require thinking about relationships between relationships, a second-order abstraction. You use probabilistic thinking daily. When you assess risks, when you understand that something is unlikely but possible, when you interpret statistics, when you make decisions under uncertainty, you are deploying cognitive structures that consolidate only in formal operations. You take this so thoroughly for granted that you probably fail to recognize it as an achievement. But try explaining probability to a 7-year-old, and you will quickly encounter the cognitive barriers that your mind has already overcome. The seventh proof emerges in your capacity to think combinatorially, to systematically generate all possible combinations of elements. Remember Antoine with the pendulum? His ability to systematically test each variable while holding others constant required combinatorial thinking. He needed to recognize that with multiple variables, there are systematic combinations to test. You do this whenever you consider all possible scenarios, whenever you recognize that there are multiple paths through a problem space, whenever you systematically enumerate options. Piaget studied this with a classic task involving colorless chemical liquids. When combined correctly, certain liquids produce a colored solution. Children are given 5 bottles and asked to figure out which combination produces the color. Concrete operational children use trial and error, mixing random combinations. Formal operational adolescents systematically test combinations, recognizing that they need to try each liquid alone, then all pairs, then all triplets, ensuring they have covered all possibilities. This combinatorial thinking underlies scientific reasoning, strategic planning, and complex problem-solving across domains. The eighth proof lives in your ability to use metaphorical and analogical reasoning at abstract levels. You can recognize structural similarities between domains that share no surface features. You understand that an atom is like a solar system, not because they look similar or are made of similar materials, but because they share abstract structural relationships. You can map concepts from one domain to another based on these deep structural correspondences. Piaget observed that formal operational thinkers suddenly become capable of understanding complex metaphors and analogies that concrete operational children interpret literally. You deploy this capacity constantly in learning and communication. Every time you understand a new concept by relating it to something you already know, every time you use analogy to explain something to someone else, every time you recognize patterns that repeat across different contexts, you are engaging formal operational thought. The ability to abstract away from surface features and operate on structural relationships is a defining characteristic of this cognitive level. The ninth and perhaps most profound proof appears in your ability to engage in what Piaget called reflective abstraction. You can abstract patterns from your own thinking and create new mental operations based on those abstractions. You can take what you learned solving one type of problem and generalize it into a strategy that applies to an entire class of problems. You can notice patterns in your own behavior and use those patterns to predict your future responses. You can recognize that certain approaches to learning work better for you than others and adjust your study strategies accordingly. This capacity to learn from your own cognitive processes, to extract principles from your experience and apply them systematically to new situations, represents the highest form of abstraction that Piaget identified. You do this constantly. Every time you reflect on what worked or did not work in a situation and extract lessons for the future, every time you recognize a pattern in your life and use that recognition to make changes, every time you develop a personal philosophy or system based on your experiences, you are engaging reflective abstraction. This is the engine of continued cognitive growth throughout adulthood, the mechanism by which you continue developing even after the basic structures of formal operational thought have consolidated. Now, take a breath and let this sink in for a moment. I have just walked you through 9 specific cognitive capacities that characterize formal operational thought. And if you are honest with yourself, You recognize most or all of them in your own thinking. These are not aspirational goals. These are current capabilities, instruments you already possess and deploy regularly. But here is the tragedy that Piaget himself recognized late in his career. In his final writings, he acknowledged something that troubled him deeply. Not everyone reaches formal operational thought, despite the biological capacity to do so. Studies across cultures have shown that formal operational reasoning appears reliably only in societies with extensive formal education. And even within those societies, many adults show formal operational thinking only in domains where they have expertise and training. Piaget initially believed that formal operations developed universally in adolescence, like previous stages, but cross-cultural research and careful reassessment forced him to revise this view. The cognitive structures necessary for formal operational thought have the potential to develop in all normally developing humans, but whether they actually consolidate depends critically on education, cultural tools, and intellectual challenges encountered during adolescence and beyond. This realization leads to a profound understanding about cognitive development that transforms how we interpret the 9 proofs I have just shared. When you demonstrate these capacities, you are not simply exhibiting universal human abilities that everyone shares equally. You are demonstrating the outcome of a developmental process that has been nurtured by your experiences, your education, your cultural context, and your intellectual engagement with complex problems. The fact that you can reason abstractly, think systematically, plan hypothetically, and reflect metacognitively is an achievement, not a baseline. It is evidence that your development has been supported, that you have encountered the kinds of challenges that promote cognitive growth, that your mind has been given the tools and opportunities it needed to construct these sophisticated mental structures. And yet, because you live surrounded by others who think similarly, because the social and professional contexts you inhabit are populated by people who also possess these capacities, you fall into the trap of assuming this is simply how everyone thinks. You fail to recognize the achievement because the reference group you compare yourself against shares the achievement. But here is where this understanding becomes practically transformative rather than just academically interesting. Once you recognize that you already possess these cognitive instruments, once you stop doubting whether your mind is adequate to complex challenges, you can shift your focus from questioning your capacity to leveraging it effectively. The problem is never that your mind cannot handle abstract reasoning, systematic analysis, hypothetical planning, or metacognitive reflection. Your mind demonstrably does these things constantly. The problem is that you doubt your capacities, and therefore fail to trust your cognitive processes when they matter most. You second-guess your analyses, you dismiss your insights, you compare yourself unfavorably to others, and assume they possess something you lack. And in doing so, you create the very inadequacy you fear. Not because your mind is insufficient, but because your beliefs about your mind become self-fulfilling prophecies that prevent you from fully utilizing the extraordinary cognitive instruments you already possess. Let me share one final case from Piaget's research that captures this perfectly. In his later studies of adolescent reasoning, Piaget worked with a 17-year-old named Michel, who was struggling academically despite clearly demonstrating formal operational capacities in casual conversation. Michel could engage in abstract political debates, could generate complex arguments about philosophy and ethics, could reason hypothetically about social issues. But when faced with academic tasks like physics problems or mathematical proofs, Michel would freeze, declare himself incapable, and give up quickly. Piaget sat with Michel and simply asked him to talk through a physics problem as if explaining it to a friend, rather than solving it formally. As Michel talked, he spontaneously generated hypotheses, reasoned about variables, designed mental experiments, and arrived at the correct solution. When Piaget pointed this out, Michel was genuinely surprised. He had solved a problem he believed himself incapable of solving, using cognitive tools he did not realize he possessed. The issue was never capacity. The issue was recognition and trust. You are Michel. We are all Michel. We possess cognitive capacities we fail to recognize and therefore fail to trust at the moments we need them most. The 9 proofs I have shared are not goals to achieve. They are mirrors reflecting what you already do, what you already are. And the transformation I'm inviting is not the acquisition of new capacities, but the recognition of existing ones. When you face a complex challenge, when you feel overwhelmed by abstraction, when you doubt whether your mind can handle what is before you, remember that your mind routinely handles abstractions of equal or greater complexity. Remember that you think systemically, hypothetically, metacognitively, proportionally, probabilistically, combinatorially, analogically, and reflectively as part of your normal cognitive functioning. The task is not to become capable of these forms of thinking. The task is to trust that you already are. This recognition carries profound implications for how you approach learning, work, and personal growth. When you encounter a domain that feels foreign, when you face concepts that seem impenetrable, the barrier is almost never that your cognitive structures are insufficient. The barrier is typically that you lack the specific knowledge, vocabulary, or context needed to apply your existing cognitive capacities effectively. And that is an entirely different problem with an entirely different solution. If the issue were insufficient cognitive capacity, the solution would be to somehow upgrade your mind, which is neither possible nor necessary. But if the issue is insufficient knowledge or context, the solution is simply to acquire that knowledge and context, which you are entirely capable of doing. You possess the cognitive tools necessary to learn any sufficiently well-explained subject within human knowledge. The question is never, can my mind handle this, but rather, do I have access to the explanations and information needed to apply my mind effectively here? And that question has practical, actionable answers. Moreover, recognizing your cognitive level allows you to make better decisions about how you invest your mental energy. You stop wasting effort doubting yourself and start directing that effort toward actually engaging challenges. You stop interpreting difficulty as evidence of inadequacy and start recognizing it as the natural experience of applying sophisticated cognitive tools to genuinely complex problems. Formal operational thought does not make problems easy. It makes hard problems solvable. The experience of struggling with complexity while successfully navigating it is exactly what formal operational thinking feels like from the inside. When you find yourself holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, weighing competing abstractions, generating and evaluating hypotheses, feeling uncertain while progressing toward understanding, that cognitive experience is not evidence that something is wrong. That is the phenomenology of formal operational thought in action. And misinterpreting that experience as inadequacy rather than recognizing it as capability deployed is the core error that keeps you stuck in self-doubt despite operating at the highest level of cognitive development Piaget identified. So what changed in Michel when he recognized his own capabilities? Nothing in his cognitive structure, everything in his willingness to trust it. He stopped asking whether he could and simply began to think, and that shift in posture, that simple decision to apply what already existed within him, transformed his relationship with academic challenges that previously paralyzed him. You carry that same possibility now. The distance between where you are and where you want to be is not a capacity gap. It is a recognition gap. You already think on another level. The 9 proofs are not future aspirations. They are descriptions of the present. Your mind has already crossed the thresholds that Piaget mapped as the pinnacle of human cognitive development. And when you fully internalize this, when you stop questioning whether your mind is sufficient and start asking only how to apply it better, everything changes. I know what it is like to be on the other side of that realization, feeling like something fundamental is missing, while you actually already possess the most sophisticated instruments that human cognition offers. If you made it this far, if these ideas resonate deeply, do not let this discovery end with this video. Join us here on the channel, where we continue exploring how Piaget taught us to see the human mind not as something fixed, but as living architecture that you can fully understand and utilize. Every week we bring insights that transform cognitive self-image into practical tools. Click the subscribe button, because you deserve to completely understand the extraordinary instrument you already are. And if you want to continue diving into this transformative understanding, watch the next video where we explore how Piaget discovered that intelligence is not about getting answers right, but about asking the right questions. You will recognize your own journey reflected in that discovery.